Nia Okafor never expected a single professional instinct to rewrite her destiny or place her in the crosshairs of the most dangerous man in Seoul. In a rain-slicked alleyway far from the sterile safety of her hospital, she saw what everyone else would have run from: a man slumped against a dumpster, his lifeblood staining the pavement a dark, jagged crimson. While the shadows of the city whispered of a war between giants, Nia only saw a patient. His suit was worth more than her annual salary, and the gun at his side warned of a violent life. But his eyes, half-lidded and defiant, belonged to someone who wasn't ready to die. His name, Jeom Tae-suk, was a myth used to frighten enemies into submission. Yet here he was, vulnerable and bleeding out. When Nia knelt in the filth and pressed her bare, steady hands against the jagged gunshot wound in his side, the world around them seemed to stop. She didn't know that she was touching a man who had forbidden anyone from seeing him weak. She didn't know she was breaking the cardinal rule of the underworld: let the monsters bury their own. But as her fingers worked with clinical precision to stem the flow, and Tae-suk's hand gripped her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible, something inside the Mafia Boss shifted. In that dark, rain-soaked moment, his cold world stopped spinning on its axis of power and aligned entirely around the woman who refused to let him slip away. Hi besties, welcome to Mafia Secret Love Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin with the story. The neon signs of Seoul's Mapo district blurred into long, jagged streaks of light against the rain-slicked pavement. Nia Okafor stood at the hospital's staff entrance, her shoulders sagging under the weight of a double shift that had felt like an eternity. The damp air hung heavy with the smell of ozone and wet asphalt, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic sting of the emergency ward she had just fled. At 32, Nia had moved to Korea seeking the quiet anonymity of a new life. But the fatigue following her now was an old, familiar friend, a deep, marrow-aching exhaustion that made her vision swim. She tightened her scarf, the fabric a small comfort against the biting wind. Her bank account was a desert, and her heart wasn't much better, but she had her discipline. She had her pride. As she began the trek toward the subway station, she took a shortcut through an alleyway she usually avoided, a narrow vein of darkness tucked between towering glass giants. The sound reached her before the sight did, a wet, rhythmic gasping that tripped her professional alarms. Nia stopped. The rain hammered against the metal dumpsters, but beneath the noise was the unmistakable sound of a man drowning on dry land. She turned her flashlight on, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a figure slumped against a pile of discarded crates. He was dressed in a suit of midnight charcoal, the silk tie loosened and soaked in something much darker than rainwater. His face was a mask of pale, aristocratic fury, jaw clenched so tight the bones seemed ready to snap. This was Jeom Tae-suk, though she didn't know his name yet. She only knew that the man before her was a map of impending death. A jagged gunshot wound tore through his side, the blood pulsing in time with his shallow, erratic breaths. Any sane person in Seoul would have turned and run. The heavy obsidian ring on his finger and the discarded handgun inches from his twitching hand screamed of a world that didn't take kindly to witnesses. But Nia wasn't just anyone. She was a nurse who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to heal it anyway. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steady despite the thunder in her chest. She dropped to her knees in the mud, her white nursing shoes instantly ruined. As she pressed her hands firmly against the wound to stem the crimson tide, Tae-suk's eyes snapped open. They were the eyes of a predator, cold, lethal, and narrowing with a sudden, sharp intensity as they locked onto hers. He reached out, his fingers bruising her wrist in a desperate, iron grip. In that moment, amidst the trash and the rain, the exhaustion vanished. The quiet life Nia had fought for died in that alleyway, replaced by the electric, terrifying heat of a man who looked at her not as a savior, but as his last remaining tether to the world. The darkness didn't fade so much as it dissolved into a disorienting, clinical brightness. Nia's first sensation wasn't the pain she expected, but the scent, not the metallic tang of the rainy alleyway, but the expensive, suffocating aroma of sandalwood and beeswax. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like leaden weights, her muscles protesting with a dull, heavy ache. As her vision cleared, the gritty shadows of Mapo were replaced by a room of terrifying opulence. She was lying on a silk-sheeted bed large enough to house her entire Chicago apartment. Above her, a tiered crystal chandelier hung like a frozen explosion, and the walls were paneled in a wood so dark it looked like obsidian. This wasn't a hospital. This was a fortress dressed in velvet. Memory rushed back in a violent surge. The heat of the blood on her hands, the weight of the bullet she'd extracted with a pocket toolkit in sheer desperation, and a heavy blow to the back of her head just as sirens began to wail in the distance. "You're awake." The voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Nia turned her head sharply, a wince catching in her throat. GM Tae-suk sat in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the room, positioned perfectly within the shadows. He was no longer the dying animal she had found in the dirt. He wore a fresh black dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and though his face was still pale, his eyes were terrifyingly alert. He watched her with the predatory stillness of a man who owned everything his gaze touched. "Where am I?" Nia asked, her voice rasping. She forced herself to sit up, clutching the silk duvet to her chest, her nurse's mind instinctively checking her own vitals. Her pulse was racing, but her hands, the hands that had saved him, were steady. "You are in a place where the police cannot find you," Tae-suk replied, rising slowly. He moved with a slight limp, a reminder of the lead she had pulled from his flesh, but his presence remained overwhelming. He crossed the room, stopping just at the edge of the bed's perimeter. "And more importantly, a place where my enemies cannot find you." "I saved your life," Nia said, her Nigerian accent thickening with her rising indignation. "I didn't ask to be kidnapped." Tae-suk leaned down, his face inches from hers. The chilling composure in his expression didn't flicker, but Nia saw a spark of something else in the depths of his dark irises, a lethal curiosity. "You did more than save a life, Dr. Okafor. You touched the untouchable. You performed a miracle in a gutter while my own men were too busy bleeding to help." He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from her jaw, tracing the air as if memorizing her silhouette. "My surgeons are compromised. The hospitals are watched. You are the only person in this city I can trust to keep me standing, because you're the only one who doesn't know enough to betray me yet. I have a job. I have a life," she countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You had a life," he corrected softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken caress. "Now, you have a patient. You will stay. You will heal me. And in return, I will make sure the people who saw your face in that alley don't erase you from existence." Nia looked past him at the heavy, reinforced oak doors. She was a healer, trapped in a palace of silk and blood, held captive by the very heartbeat she had restarted. The golden cage had locked, and the key was currently staring at her with the eyes of a king. Nia didn't back down. Though her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, she forced her professional mask into place, the one that had commanded chaotic emergency rooms and silenced rowdy wards back in Chicago and Lagos. She threw back the silk duvet, her ruined nursing shoes hitting the polished floor with a defiant thud. She didn't look like a captive. She looked like a woman about to take charge of a failing shift. "If I am your doctor, then you are my patient," she said, her voice dropping into a low, clinical tone that brooked no argument. "And in my world, Mr. GM, a king is just another body made of bone and blood. If you want to keep that heart beating, you will sit down." Tae-suk paused, his eyes narrowing. No one spoke to him this way. His guards, shadows perpetually stationed at the door, shifted visibly, their hands twitching toward their jackets. But Tae-suk held up a single, scarred hand, silencing them without a glance. A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, not one of kindness, but of genuine intrigue. He sat. Nia moved toward him, her movements fluid and efficient. She didn't flinch as she reached for the buttons of his shirt. For a second, his entire body tensed, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but she ignored it. She peeled back the fabric to inspect her handiwork from the alley. The wound was angry, the skin around the stitches bruised a deep purple, but it wasn't necrotic. "You're running a fever," she noted, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. It was an intimate, domestic gesture that felt like a lightning strike in the middle of the cold, sterile room. Tae-suk froze, his breath hitching. "Your body is fighting the trauma. You need fluids, high-dose antibiotics, and absolute bed rest for the next 48 hours. If you try to lead a war council or execute a rival before Tuesday, you'll be dead by Wednesday." "I have a business to run," he rasped, his voice tight, as she began to clean the site with a fresh antiseptic she found in a nearby medical kit, likely prepared by his previous, compromised doctor. "And I have a medical license that says you're an idiot if you try," Nia countered, dabbing the wound. She looked up, locking eyes with him. The distance between them was negligible, close enough for her to see the gold flecks in his dark irises and the weariness he hid from the rest of the world. "I don't care how many men you have under your thumb. Right now, you're under mine. You will eat what I prescribe, you will sleep when I tell you, and you will stop looking at me like I'm a piece of property. I'm the only thing standing between you and a casket." The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken power. The guards looked as if they expected Tae-suk to snap her neck. Instead, the Mafia Boss let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes but softened the lethal edge of his posture. "You have a lot of fire for someone in a cage, Nia Okafor," he murmured, the use of her name sounding like a vow. "Fire is the only thing that stays warm in a place this cold," she replied, taping a fresh dressing over his side. She stepped back, putting professional distance between them once more. "Now lie back. That's a doctor's order. If you break my stitches, I won't be so gentle the second time." Tae-suk watched her for a long moment, measuring her resolve against his own. Finally, he reclined against the pillows, his gaze never leaving her face. For the first time in his life, he wasn't obeying a command. He was granting his respect. The days in the GM estate began to bleed together into a rhythmic cycle of bandage changes for drips and the heavy, watchful silence of the man in the bed. As Tae-suk's strength returned, the atmosphere in the room shifted from the cold, clinical air of a prison to something warmer and more volatile. He no longer looked at Nia as a tool for his survival, but as a person, a realization that made her pulse stutter more than the threat of his guards ever had. On the fifth evening, the rain returned, drumming a steady, melancholy beat against the reinforced glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tae-suk sat shirtless by the hearth, the firelight dancing across a torso that Nia now knew intimately, though only through the lens of her profession. She moved behind him to inspect his secondary scar. Not the fresh, angry red of the alleyway wound, but a jagged, silvered mark that ran from his shoulder blade down to his ribs. "This didn't come from bullet," Nia murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of the old tissue with a lightness she hadn't intended. "This was a blade, and it was done from behind." Tae-suk stiffened under her touch, his muscles coiling like tempered steel. For a moment, she thought he would dismiss her, but the firelight seemed to pull the truth from him. 10 years ago," he said, his voice a low rasp that barely rose above the crackle of the wood. "I wasn't the ice boss. I was a man who believed in loyalty. I had a brother, not by blood but by oath. We shared everything. Dreams of a legitimate empire, a way out of the dirt." Nia paused, her hand resting on his shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a living heat that contradicted his frozen reputation. "What happened?" The man I called brother sold my location to the union for a seat at a table that didn't even have room for him, Tae-suk said, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping his throat. He drove a knife in while we were celebrating a successful shipment. He thought he killed me. He didn't realize that when you kill a man's heart, you simply leave behind a machine that doesn't know how to stop. Nia felt a pang of sharp, unexpected empathy. She thought of her own scars, the foster homes where she had learned to keep her head down, the fiancé in Chicago who had drained her bank account and left her with an eviction notice. They were both survivors of a world that took without asking. So you became the monster they feared, Nia whispered, moving around to face him. She didn't pull away when his gaze locked onto hers. I became what was necessary to survive, he corrected, reaching up to take her hand. His fingers were calloused, but surprisingly gentle as they wrapped around hers. In my world, trust is a luxury that costs a life. I haven't let anyone stand behind me since that night, Nia. Not until you. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a sudden electric tension. Nia looked down at their joined hands, the dark, powerful hand of a killer and the steady, resilient hand of a healer. She saw the man behind the myth, a soul burdened by the weight of 1,000 betrayals, looking for a reason to thaw. I'm not here to judge your past, Tae-suk, she said softly, her thumb brushing against his knuckles. I'm here to make sure you have a future. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let go. In the silence of the mansion, the secret he had shared felt like a bridge built across an impossible divide, and for the first time, Nia realized that the most dangerous thing in this house wasn't the guns or the guards. It was the way her heart beat faster when he looked at her. The fragile peace of the sick room shattered at 3 in the morning. It wasn't a loud noise, but rather the absence of one. The sudden, rhythmic silencing of the crickets outside and the faint, metallic snick of a glass cutter against the balcony window. Nia, sleeping fitfully in the armchair by the hearth, bolted upright. Her nurse's instincts, honed by years of monitoring the subtle shifts in a patient's breathing, told her the air in the room had changed. It was cold, sharp, and carried the scent of wet stone. Before she could draw breath to scream, a heavy, warm hand clamped firmly over her mouth. She thrashed for a second until she smelled the familiar cedar and sandalwood. Tae-suk was hovering over her, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the dying embers of the fire. He wasn't the convalescent patient anymore. He was a wraith of pure, lethal intent. He pressed a single finger to his lips, his dark eyes burning with a warning that froze the blood in her veins. With his other hand, he pulled her silently from the chair, tucking her body behind his own as he backed toward the recessed wardrobe. He moved with a predatory grace that ignored the fresh stitches in his side, his focus locked on the heavy velvet curtains draped over the balcony doors. A gloved hand parted the fabric. The moonlight caught the suppressed barrel of a handgun. In one fluid motion, Tae-suk lunged. He didn't use a gun. He used the environment. He grabbed a heavy bronze statuette from the side table and hurled it with bone-shattering force. As the assassin stumbled, Tae-suk was on him, a blur of motion that was terrifying to behold. There was no cinematic flair, only the brutal, efficient sounds of the man who had mastered the art of survival. The thud of a kidney blow, the sickening crack of a wrist, and the heavy fall of a body hitting the floor. Nia watched from the shadows, her hands trembling. She was a woman who preserved life, now staring at a man who ended it with the same clinical precision she used to save it. Tae-suk didn't stop until the intruder was limp. He didn't call for his guards immediately. Instead, he turned back to Nia. The ice boss persona was cracked. His chest was heaving, and a small bloom of red was beginning to stain his fresh bandages where he had pushed his body too far. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands reaching out to frame her face. His touch was frantic, searching for a wound, a scratch, any sign that the world had dared to hurt her. "Are you harmed?" he demanded, his voice a low, jagged growl. "I'm fine," Nia whispered, her voice shaking as she looked at the carnage across the room and then back to the man holding her. "Tae-suk, you're wound. You're bleeding. Let it bleed," he rasped, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. His grip on her jaw was fierce, a possessive claim that shook her to her core. "He saw you. He was in this room with you." The sheer, raw protectiveness in his tone was more overwhelming than the violence that had preceded it. For the first time, Nia realized she wasn't just his doctor, and she wasn't just a captive. She was the one thing in his world he refused to lose, and God help anyone who stood in the way of that resolve. Only then did he press the silent alarm. The room soon swarming with black-suited men, but Tae-suk never moved his body from the line of sight between Nia and the door. He remained her shield, a monster standing guard over his only light. The aftermath of the attack left the mansion wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence that was far more intimate than the quiet of the previous days. The assassins had been cleared away, the broken glass replaced, and the guards doubled, but inside the master suite, the air remained thick with the scent of adrenaline and unsaid things. Tae-suk refused to let Nia leave his sight, and Nia, shaken by the raw violence she had witnessed, found that she didn't want to go. She sat him down on the edge of the bed to redress the wound he had agitated during the struggle. Her hands, usually as steady as stone, had a slight tremor that she couldn't suppress. As she soaked a cloth in warm water, she felt his gaze tracking her every move, no longer cold or calculating, but burning with a dark, restless heat. "You should be resting," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Your heart rate is too high." "It isn't the injury, Nia," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. She paused, the damp cloth hovering over his skin. She looked up, and the breath died in her throat. The distance between them was a dangerous precipice. In the amber glow of the bedside lamp, the ice boss looked human, stripped of his armor and his titles. He looked like a man who had spent a lifetime in the cold and had finally walked into the sun. "You're a healer," he whispered, his hand reaching out to cover hers, pinning the cloth against his chest. His skin was searingly hot. "But there are some fevers you can't cure with medicine." Nia knew she should pull away. She was a professional, a woman who had moved across the world to escape the complications of the heart. But as his thumb brushed over her knuckles, the wall she had built around herself in Chicago began to crumble. She saw the longing in his eyes, a reflection of the same quiet loneliness she had carried through the streets of Seoul. "I came here to save your life, Tae-suk," she said, her voice trembling. "Not to lose mine to you." "Then don't," he rasped. He leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers. "Just stay. Just for tonight. Don't be a nurse, and I won't be a king. Be the woman who saw me in the rain." The tension that had been building since that first night in the alleyway finally snapped. It wasn't a gentle breaking, but a tidal wave. Nia closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of salt, cedar, and desperation. It was a collision of two worlds that should never have touched, the healer and the hunter, the light and the shadow. His hands, the same hands that had dealt death only hours before, were incredibly gentle as they tangled in her hair, pulling her closer as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Nia felt the world outside the mansion, the rivals, the police, the foster homes, and the debt, fade into insignificance. In this gilded cage, under the watchful eyes of 1,000 shadows, she had found a different kind of fever, one that burned brighter and more dangerously than anything she had ever known. And as he pulled her down onto the silk sheets, Nia realized she wasn't just healing his scars anymore. She was becoming one of them, etched into his life forever. The fragile bubble of their shared intimacy didn't just pop, it was incinerated. 2 days after the night that had changed everything, the high-definition monitors in Tae-suk's study flickered with a message that bypassed every firewall in the mansion. It wasn't a threat against the GM empire. It was a picture of a woman bound to a chair in a derelict basement, her eyes wide with a terror that Nia recognized instantly. "Ji-hai," Nia whispered, her knees nearly giving out. It was her only friend in Seoul, a fellow nurse who had covered her shifts and shared her ramen when Nia first arrived. The message from the rival union was simple: the doctor for the girl. Nia turned to Tae-suk, her face ashen. She expected the man who had kissed her with such tenderness to offer comfort, but the person standing before her now was a stranger. The warmth had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a terrifying, frozen void. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he began barking orders in rapid-fire Korean to his lieutenants, his voice as sharp as a guillotine. "I have to go to them," Nia said, stepping into his line of sight, her voice trembling. "She's innocent, Tae-suk. She has nothing to do with this." Tae-suk finally looked at her, and the coldness in his gaze made her flinch. "You are going nowhere. They don't want a nurse. They want a lever to break my neck. If you step outside these gates, you are dead, and she is dead anyway." "Then do something," she shouted, the frustration and fear boiling over. "You claim to be so powerful, but my friend is suffering because I saved your life." Tae-suk walked toward her, his presence suddenly suffocating. He didn't stop until he was inches away, forcing her to look up into the face of the monster he had tried to hide from her. "You want her back? Then you have to stop looking at me like a man who needs healing. You have to trust the man who knows how to destroy." He reached for his jacket, concealing a sleek, blackened firearm in a holster Nia hadn't seen him wear before. "I'm going to bring her back. But to do it, I will have to burn that basement to the ground. There will be no medicine tonight, Nia. Only blood." For the first time, Nia saw the true darker side of the man she was falling for. The ruthless efficiency of a predator who didn't negotiate with threats. He wasn't going to pay a ransom. He was going to exert attacks on lives. "Stay in this room," he commanded, his hand momentarily lingering on the doorframe. "If I don't come back, my men have orders to fly you out of the country. Don't look for me." Nia watched him walk away, the heavy doors latching with a finality that echoed through her soul. She was a healer, a woman who believed every life was sacred. But as she paced the confines of her gilded cage, she found herself praying for Tae-suk's violence to be swift and absolute. She was forced to trust the very darkness she had tried to light, realizing that in his world, love wasn't a sanctuary, it was a war. The silence that followed Tae-suk's departure was short-lived. He had successfully retrieved Ji-hai, sending her safely to a hidden clinic, but the act had lit a fuse that finally reached the powder keg of the GM estate. The Union hadn't just wanted the nurse. They had used the rescue to track Tae-suk's movements back to his sanctuary. The siege began not with a bang, but with the sudden, haunting death of the mansion's power. The crystal chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the opulent halls into a terrifying, suffocating blackness. Red emergency lights bled into the corridors, casting long, demonic shadows against the obsidian walls. Then came the rhythm of the end, the distant, muffled thud of flashbangs and the relentless, mechanical chatter of automatic gunfire echoing from the lower perimeter. Nia stood in the center of the master suite, her breath hitching in her throat. She wasn't a soldier, but she knew the sound of a body under siege. The mansion was no longer a cage or a palace. It was an organism fighting for its life. The doors burst open, and Tae-suk stumbled in, his black shirt shredded and soaked with a fresh, hot crimson that wasn't his own. He was a vision of beautiful, terrible carnage. He didn't speak. He grabbed Nia by the waist and shoved her into the walk-in vault behind the bed, his movements frantic. "Stay down," he roared over the rising cacophony of shattering glass. But Nia watched through the heavy steel gap as the unthinkable happened. A secondary team of infiltrators, led by Tae-suk's own disgruntled lieutenant, the ghost of another betrayal, sprinted onto the balcony. Tae-suk turned, his gun raised, but his slide locked back with a hollow, metallic click. He was empty. The lieutenant leveled his weapon at Tae-suk's chest, a look of triumphal malice twisting his features. The ice boss finally thaws, the man sneered. And now, you evaporate. Nia didn't think. She didn't weigh her oath to do no harm against the survival of the man she loved. Her eyes landed on the heavy obsidian sculpture on the nightstand, the same one Tae-suk had used to defend her nights before. She lunged out of the vault, her movements fueled by a primal, protective fury she didn't know she possessed. As the lieutenant began to squeeze the trigger, Nia swung the heavy stone with every ounce of her strength. It connected with the side of the man's skull with a sickening, wet crunch. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, his shot firing harmlessly into the ceiling. The room went silent, save for the ringing in Nia's ears and the heavy, ragged breathing of two people who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. Nia dropped the bloodied stone, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip her own elbows to stay upright. She looked at the man on the floor, then at her hands, the hands of a healer, now stained with the weight of a different kind of salvation. Tae-suk crossed the distance between them in a single stride, pulling her into a crushing embrace. He didn't care about the gunfire still raging outside or the empire he was losing. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his body trembling with a rare, raw emotion. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice breaking. Again, Nia clung to him, the scent of gunpowder and cedar filling her lungs. "I told you, Tae-suk," she whispered into his chest, her tears finally falling. "I'm here to make sure you have a future, no matter what I have to break to give it to you." In the ruins of his empire, amidst the smoke and the blood, the healer had finally used the hunter's tools, and the bond between them was no longer just a debt. It was a covenant. The transition from the world of shadows to the world of light didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, meticulous dismantling led by a man who had realized that a throne was merely a cold seat in a lonely room. In the months following the siege, GM Tae-suk systematically liquidated his holdings, severing ties with the syndicates and handing over evidence that effectively crippled the union. He didn't just step down. He burned the ladder behind him, trading his title as the Shadow Emperor for the simple, terrifying freedom of a clean slate. Nia had returned to her life, or at least a version of it. She was back in a uniform, though this time she worked in a small, bustling community clinic on the outskirts of Seoul. The gold-leafed ceilings of the mansion were gone, replaced by the humming fluorescent lights of the ward and the familiar, grounding scent of rubbing alcohol. She had insisted on the distance, needing to know if she was still the woman who had arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a dream of healing. But every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of a cedar-scented embrace and the weight of a hand that had once held a gun but now sought only her pulse. On a Tuesday evening, as a soft spring rain began to wash away the winter grit of the city, Nia finished her final rounds. She hung her stethoscope around her neck, her joints aching with the familiar fatigue of a long shift. She pushed open the heavy glass doors of the clinic, expecting to see the usual rush of umbrellas and commuters. Instead, she saw a car she didn't recognize. Not the armored black sedan of Mafia King, but a simple, understated vehicle parked at the curb. Leaning against it was a man who looked younger than he had months ago, his face no longer a mask of frozen steel. He wore a plain navy sweater and jeans, his hair ruffled by the damp wind. There were no guards flanking him, no shadows lurking in the periphery. Nia stopped on the clinic steps, her heart skipping a beat. "Tae-suk." He pushed off the car and walked toward her, his limp nearly gone, his movements light and unburdened. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the space she had asked for. The gold flecks in his dark eyes were bright with a nervous, vulnerable energy she had never seen before. "I'm late for my checkup," he said, his voice a low, warm vibration that made her skin tingle. Nia smiled, the tension finally leaving her shoulders for the first time since that night in the rain. "I think you've healed just fine on your own." "Not entirely," he replied, stepping closer until the scent of cedar and rain enveloped her once more. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I've spent my whole life being someone's boss or someone's enemy. I'm tired of being a myth, Nia. I just want to be the man who takes you to dinner. Nia looked at the hand that had once bruised her wrist in a desperate grip, now offering her a future built on choice rather than blood. She reached up, covering his hand with hers, the healer and the man finally meeting on level ground. I think I can manage that, she whispered. As they walked together into the Seoul twilight, the neon signs flickered to life, but they weren't jagged or threatening anymore. They were just lights on a path toward something new, a life where the scars remained, but the wounds were finally, truly closed. The empire had fallen, but in its place, something far more powerful had begun to grow.